Well, welcome to the final session of day one, where we'll be hearing a keynote from Dr. Vanessa Ogle on the topic of decolonisation is also a movement of money. As you just heard, I'm John Christensen. I chair the board of directors of the Tax Justice Network, and I was co-producer of a documentary film called The Spider's Web, Britain's Second Empire, which explored how the City of London morphed from its previous role as the beating financial heart center of the former empire into a global offshore financial center using its extensive web of satellite tax havens in the British Crown dependencies and overseas territories, and used these territories to extract mobile capital from across the world. Now, as a child, I grew up on the British Crown dependency of Jersey at a period through the 1960s and 70s when very large numbers of former colonialists were resettling on that island. And these former colonialists were coming from countries like Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ghana, South Africa, India, which had overthrown their colonial governments and secured independence from the British Empire. Now, many of the former colonialists were very, very wealthy indeed, people who would now be categorized by banks and by wealth managers as high net wealth individuals, henwies, they're called in banking circles. And these henwies brought their wealth back with them, and they arrived in sufficient numbers to transform Jersey in many ways. For example, their incoming wealth contributed to Jersey's development as a tax haven, creating banking links between St. Helier and many countries that were formerly part of the British Empire and beyond, especially thinking about banks like Standard Chartered, Standard Bank, HSBC, and the Bank of India, all of which had large wealth management branches in St. Helier from the 1960s onwards. Now, the arrival of these former colonialists also reshaped Jersey's culture. They formed a new elite, largely detached from other sections of Jersey society, but they were very politically influential. They used their wealth to buy some of the finest properties on the island. Their sons and daughters were sent to elite schools that are separate from other school children on the island. They were highly vocal in criticizing progressive politics and promoting ultra-conservative attitudes on race, civil rights, and British exceptionalism. So that's the island I grew up on. To put it mildly, they were very hostile also to democracy, especially attempts by the British Prime Minister in the 60s and 70s, Harold Wilson, to tax and regulate British tax havens. Now, for the retreating colonialists arriving in Jersey, the key attractions of that island included the fact that the island imposes a very low rate of income tax, no capital gains tax, no wealth taxes, no inheritance taxes, and extraordinarily low rates of property tax. The island's corporate tax regime exempted companies which were registered in Jersey but not trading on the island, and that perfectly suited wealthy investors with commercial activities in Africa or the Middle East or elsewhere. So Dr. Vanessa Ogle's research on decolonisation and the emergence of a global spider's web of tax havens in the 50s and 60s has a very special interest for me, since I grew up and I mixed socially with these former colonialists who moved to Jersey with their wealth and turned that island into a very prominent offshore satellite of the City of London. Now, one of the factors that attracted so many of these British former colonialists who were retreating from Africa and India to Jersey ties in with Dr. Ogle's earlier research into technology change and the globalization of timekeeping. And you might know her book about called the Global Transformation of Time, in which she explores these issues. And I think it was very relevant to Jersey's development as a tax haven, because in the early 1960s, jet aircraft started to fly to Jersey from London, and that reduced the travel time to just 45 minutes per flight. And this technology change allowed ultra-rich elites living in Jersey to fly to London on what was called the red-eye special in the early morning and fly home to Jersey the same night. And conversely, London bankers and lawyers could fly in the other direction carrying out a full day's work in Centralia and returning at night. And it's interesting because similar flights went to Geneva. No other destination in Europe, just Geneva. Again, allowing daily flights to and from Geneva. So technology change and being in a time zone convenient to both Geneva and London played a key part in Jersey's development as a tax haven. So I'm really delighted that Dr. Ogle is giving our keynote address on the topic of decolonization. It's also a movement of money. Dr. Ogle is an associate professor and historian at the University of Berkeley. As I mentioned earlier, she's the author of a fascinating history of time called The Global Transformation of Time, 1870 to 1950. And more recently, she authored a fascinating paper called Archipelago Capitalism, Tax Havens, Offshore Money, and the State, 1950s to 70s. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us today. We're all looking forward very much to hearing your keynote address. The floor is yours. And can I remind listeners to post their questions to the Q&A channel, and we hope to allow plenty of time for Vanessa to give answers to your questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, and also thanks to the organizers for bringing together this really fascinating event. I very much enjoyed listening to the presentations and discussions so far today, and I look forward to tomorrow. It's really terrific to have an entire conference devoted to this, I think, really, really important topic. Thanks to John also for the very generous and helpful introduction. I will say, of course, that when I sort of do my research in the archives, these sort of stories are not necessarily what I find there. In the archives, you see sort of the tip of an iceberg, and you see these sort of hints here and there, but these stories that you related from growing up in this very particular place, you know, give it sort of a different kind of texture that I think is very helpful and important to also include in these stories as much as we can. We can't do it for all sort of instances, but sometimes we can. And I should say that just as a brief addition to your point about technology, the same actually happens in the Bahamas in the early 1960s. So the availability of commercial flights to the American continent sort of has a similar effect on the expansion of business there exactly at the same time. So the technology and communication infrastructure aspect of all this is important. Okay, so what I'll do today is I'll talk about decolonization, and as was said, sort of the relationship of this major period during which former colonies became independent to the expansion of tax havens and sort of the offshore economy, generally speaking. And I do want to say that this is research based on a book that I'm currently writing on the history of the offshore world more broadly, starting in the 1920s and carrying the story of how offshore emerged sort of as a full-fledged system into the 1980s, which is roughly where, for me, sort of things stop. And I should also say that the topic of today's keynote is something that I recently fleshed out in another article that actually just was published in November in the journal Past and Present, where I elaborate on this particular constellation of decolonization and the expansion of offshore. So should you be interested in hearing and reading more about this than what I'm able to present today and say in the discussion, then I'm happy to send you the PDF if you can't access it. If you send me an email, or you can also send me a message on Twitter if you prefer that. Or you can go to the journal's website and find the article there if you have an academic connection that allows you to do that. So I'll start by telling you a little bit more about sort of offshore and the offshore economy as a sort of backdrop. So for my purposes, for much of the 20th century and the period that I'm looking at, as you can see up on the slide, the offshore economy consists of 4 ingredients and 4 elements. First, tax havens, which is what I'll focus on today. Then offshore financial, money and bond markets. Something called free trade zones, sometimes referred to as foreign trade zones, sometimes referred to as export processing zones. The terminology varies a little bit depending on where and when you look. These are sites sort of carved out of national territory where taxes and regulation are low, to sort of create, if you want, sort of tax havens within a country. And the last element of this broader offshore economy are so-called flags of convenience registries, which are jurisdictions that allow you to register a ship regardless which nationality you have as the owner of the ship, and regardless what and where the ship sort of carries out business. It just means that if the ship flies the flag of particular jurisdictions, the profits it generates are tax-free or are taxed at very low rates. And it also means that labor and other safety regulations are normally sort of much more lax for these flags of convenience ships than for other ships. And I mention these 4 ingredients because, to me, as a historian who sort of works in archives, they are actually they overlap quite a bit. So tax havens were also sites where flags of convenience ships were registered in the 1950s and 60s, where eventually offshore money markets took place. And some places like Panama are sort of all 3. They have a sort of a foreign trade zone. They're also a tax haven, and they also offer ship and flag registration. So while it's helpful to distinguish these different elements, when you look at the sort of genealogy of offshore more broadly, these things sort of overlap and often are 2 or more things at the same time. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about tax havens. I very much simplify here for the purpose of keeping this brief and easy to understand. Tax havens are understood as jurisdictions with low or 0 tax rates, generally across the board, or for certain circumstances. They offer easy registration processes, and they normally also provide certain secrecy provisions for the owners of assets. Tax havens in the modern 20th century sense are a product of the First World War and the interwar period. Following the introduction of mass-based progressive income taxes during the First World War, tax havens emerged in the interwar years in Switzerland, a little bit already in the Channel Islands, in Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and even in Bahamas and Bermuda. During the Second World War, tax havens by no means lay dormant. Rather, European havens such as Switzerland, but also beginning Liechtenstein and Monaco, became places where mostly Nazis, rather than the victims of the Nazi regime, conducted business to evade embargoes, to evade blacklists, and where they basically hid their own assets. And they also became places where, after the war, Nazis basically temporarily fled to offshore themselves and their assets further to places in Latin America and the Middle East, for example. After World War II, again, against the backdrop of increased taxes from the 1950s to the 1970s, havens grew rapidly. And they now expanded in a number of sort of new shelters in Hong Kong and Singapore and Panama, but also business expanded in the Cayman Islands, in Bermuda, and in the Bahamas. And then you have a third period of expansion of offshore that follows roughly from the 1970s, 80s to the 1990s, this time primarily in the Indian Ocean. So I want to show you a slide which captures this sort of geographic division of labor that overlaps with the chronology a little bit. So the first wave of havens is primarily European, and this is where you get the havens that are listed here with the names, and then obviously the sort of geographic detail here. The second period of expansion in the 1950s and 60s features many of these havens over here, the Caribbean ones in the geographic detail. And then in the third phase, you get a sort of geographically more scattered spread where you have the Indian Ocean and the Pacific with sort of additional places that join the tax haven ranks. And the fact that this third period from the 1970s, 80s on happens in a slightly sort of more incoherent and scattered way, as I said, has to do not least with the changing importance of geography and the changing quality and generally sort of availability of means of communication and transportation, something that John alluded to when mentioning flights to Jersey, and that I said was equally also relevant for the Bahamas in the early 1960s. Okay. All right. So in this periodization, in these different phases, the European one, the middle one, and then the sort of final one, the 1950s to 70s were particularly important, as I argue. These decades marked a crucial phase for the development of offshore business for the following reasons. To understand tax havens, we really have to think of them as a kind of ecosystem that comprises a broad variety of actors in multiple sites, not just in the tax havens, but for instance, in London, in New York, in Zurich, and so on. And the proliferation of tax havens during this period from the 1950s to 70s was crucial because it gave this ecosystem time to develop and to become institutionalized. It was time for lawyers to write laws that set up territories as tax havens, time for local governments in tax haven territories to pass such laws, and also in many cases to become involved with tax haven business themselves. And finally, it was time for bankers and accountants to devise and sell products to create an entire avoidance industry involving advertising, specialist publications, and even seminars you could attend to inform yourself about which particular tax haven might be the sort of perfectly tailored option for your tax problem, as it was branded. So all in all, the 1950s to 70s were therefore instrumental to the spread and institutionalization of this offshore economy. Now, when we look at these decades, it is striking, of course, that these were simultaneously the main years of decolonization. And many, if not all, tax havens were current or former dependent territories of some form of the British Empire. So this leads me to ask today, what was the relationship between decolonization and this expansion of offshore business that happened at the same time? In order to investigate this, I want to briefly take us to a number of European settler colonies. These settler colonies were mentioned previously in some of the talks already today. Settler colonies in the British as well as the French Empire around the time of the 1950s and 60s. What did things look like for, in this case, white settlers, colonial officials, and businessmen, say in Kenya, in Rhodesia, in Algeria, or Morocco? At this time, the growth of anti-colonial independence movements was signaling to those who were paying attention the likely end of white rule. Europeans and colonies, especially those who owned land, farms, factories, and other business, began to worry about decolonization and the impending basically change in power relationships. After decades of coercive and violent European conquest and colonial rule, revengeful new leaders might stand to impose taxes and restrictions on European business activity, investments, and capital movements. And worse, these new leaders could theoretically expropriate and nationalize European property without paying adequate compensation. Savvy and well-connected, the better off among these Europeans decided to not leave these matters to chance. Lawyers and bankers in London, Nairobi, and Nassau very eagerly offered their help. And to avoid having to share the wealth they previously extracted from the land and labor of their former subjects, White Britons with colonial investments and other property liquidated these assets where it was possible and sent the proceedings abroad. And this meant that a massive outflow of money from the late colonial British Empire began, a really sort of what you could call a money panic in these years. So I want to show you a slide that lists some of these instances, as I won't be able to go into sort of much detail about all of them, but to just give you a sense of the scope and the kind of time frame that we're talking about of what was happening here. So for my purposes, the story really begins in China and Shanghai in the years leading up to the establishment of the People's Republic of China, when you have an exodus of funds from mainland China and especially from Shanghai to Hong Kong. And this really sort of is the beginning of Hong Kong as a gradually sort of more important financial center. Now, China obviously was not a former colony in that sense, but it was what historians characterize sort of as a site of informal empire, where European and also in that case of American presence had taken on certain characteristics of colonial rule without establishing sort of formal possessions. And some of the outflow of funds here are precisely so from that source. We then get to North Africa and money sort of leaving places like Morocco and moving to Switzerland, also into China, to Monaco. We have oil money and the first examples of that coming out of sort of other parts of the Middle East and the Gulf, and moving to Beirut, which at this point was a tax haven, as well as Switzerland. With the Suez Crisis, there's money moving out of Egypt to Switzerland. And very importantly, an event that sort of registers very heavily here in this context, we have the Belgian Congo and its independence ultimately in 1960 and money moving to Switzerland, but also to Luxembourg, where it fuels the expand or sort of the, really sort of the beginnings of Luxembourg as a more significant tax haven. And we then have Algeria to Switzerland, and also in the 1960s, Kenya and Rhodesia, the British settler colonies to the Bahamas, as well as other places in the Caribbean, also to the Bahamas. And these last examples, I'll talk a little bit more about those now. So these funds that left the colonial world with the onset of decolonization did not simply return to metropolitan Britain or France, but rather such money that was disinvested and removed from the late colonial world was often moved to tax havens. This meant that the expansion of tax haven business was fueled by such funds that were departing the late colonial world. In the early 1960s, settlers in the British colonies of Kenya and Rhodesia began sending liquidated assets to the Bahamas and the Channel Islands, thus contributing to the growth of tax haven activity in these places. But as John alluded to in his introductory remarks, often it was in fact the case that former officials, settlers, and businessmen sent not only their money to tax havens, but they decided to settle entirely in such jurisdictions. And this is what happened in the Channel Islands and Jersey in particular in the early 1960s. Later in the 1960s, Malta, which was another tax haven that emerged from the folds of the British Empire during these years, sought to attract these returnees from empire as permanent settlers with special tax incentives. So that's another example of that. Similar developments unfolded in other European empires. In the French Empire, it was above all the sizable settler colonies of Tunisia and especially Morocco and Algeria that sent money to tax havens. Wealthy Frenchmen had for centuries, in fact, relied on the services of Geneva and other Swiss bankers to conceal their riches from prying tax authorities and revolutionary fervor alike. And during the years of decolonization, French settlers and investors in the empire quietly moved their liquid funds to the tax haven of Switzerland. As their counterparts in the British Empire, some former residents of French colonies chose to relocate entirely to a tax haven, in this case, Monaco. The tiny principality had seen some very small scale tax haven activity already during the interwar years, but its real takeoff came in the 1950s, not least as a result of funds and settlers from French North Africa and Indochina. As European settlers, officials, and businessmen pondered where to stash their cash after decolonization, their choices were shaped by fiscal circumstances, both in colonies and also in metropolitan countries like the UK. When colonies became independent in the 1960s, tax rates in metropolitan Britain had reached considerable levels. By contrast, in the colonial world, taxes on white Europeans had, on average, been much lower than, if you want, at home. Settlers in colonies and lobbyists opposed progressive income taxes across the empire as long as they could. And when taxes finally came, Europeans, at least that's what the documents say, proved very adept at cheating. Officials complained about the difficulties of collecting colonial taxes among the white population and often looked at considerable shortfalls and arrears. In the empire, white tax morale was notoriously low. And white taxation, and this is something that emerges much more clearly from Madeleine Woker's work and also, I believe, Lauren's work. White taxation therefore stood in quite sort of stark contrast with the various taxes imposed on colonized subjects. Such taxes reached substantial amounts when taking into account the ability to pay, and they were also often very harshly enforced with the help of violence. So I just want to show you one slide, one image that encapsulates a little bit of this sort of history of a colonial tax morale and reluctance and resistance to taxation among white Europeans in colonies. So this is the cover of a little sort of brochure, an information leaflet that was put up by a society trying to attract settlers to Kenya in the interwar period. I think it's from 1922 or 23, if I remember correctly. And this little booklet says up here, if you might be able to read that, the colony without income tax, as at that point, Kenya was still a place that could claim, as opposed to other colonies, to not yet have income taxes and to sort of offer that as a special incentive and bonus to potential settlers. So in concluding, I want to briefly ask what the consequences of all this were. It obviously fueled the growth of tax havens, which is sort of the story that I mostly focus on in the book, where this is sort of one chapter. But I do want to focus here primarily on the impact this had on low-income developing countries and what it sort of meant for their trajectory going forward in the decades after decolonization. Low white tax morale and the connections forged by departing Europeans to bankers and lawyers in the Bahamas and the Channel Islands and elsewhere in the offshore world settled these newly independent countries in the global south with a difficult economic legacy. The late colonial money panics that descended on European empires on the eve of decolonization led to illegal capital flight on a massive scale. And as a consequence, newly independent countries looking to jumpstart programs of economic growth found themselves in dire need of foreign investments and foreign capital. this, of course, increased the dependence on aid going forward. An even bigger problem, perhaps, was that local wealthy elites in the global south soon discovered the advantages of a Swiss or Bahamas bank account for themselves, meaning the same bankers and lawyers who had previously recruited European tax evaders now turned to political leaders and others holding wealth in newly independent countries. And thereby, of course, they contributed to a sort of ongoing culture of tax evasion and low tax compliance that continues to be a problem. The history of tax havens shows that those seeking to conceal wealth from taxation relied on a very sophisticated operation among various professional groups. Today, many global south countries certainly find themselves held back by low levels of tax enforcement, corruption, and illegal capital flight. But the enablers, the lawyers, consultants, and other white-collar professionals who make up the tax avoidance industry are largely still based in Europe and in the United States. This was no different some 60 or 70 years ago, when late colonial white flight sent European assets to a flourishing landscape of offshore tax havens. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. And not surprisingly, you've raised a number of questions. So I'm going to go straight to the questions that are still coming in. The first question came from Nigel Munusami, and I'm going to run two questions from Nigel together into one. Is there a moral justification for the existence of tax havens? He asks. Are they all about tax avoidance or evasion? So that's part one of the question. And then he asks, would the closing or effective isolation of these tax havens significantly solve our financial problems? Are the sums they shelter too small to worry about? And is our objection mostly moral? So would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. So the moral justification for tax havens, I mean, you know, the people who argue that there is a moral justification for tax havens, they would say, well, you know, they help people who are, for instance, you know, in sort of contexts where they have to fear for their political and other safety. They're being targeted or prosecuted by their authoritarian or whatever, you know, or sort of dictatorial government. And for these kind of situations and people who would face such problems, the secrecy and the sort of possibilities offered through tax havens, you know, are a sort of way to do things that they otherwise could not do, and to also just, you know, shelter assets safely away from the grip of politically hostile regimes. I'm not a contemporary economist who sort of investigates these kind of claims, but there are some people who do sort of look into this, and their work mostly finds that these kind of claims are, you know, they're sort of very thin. The evidence for that kind of, you know, being sort of the typical customer and client using tax havens, the evidence for that is extremely thin. From my historical work, I can say that it plays almost no role. So I would say, you know, it's very hard to sort of find a kind of real moral justification for this, certainly from a historical perspective. The question of isolation, or, you know, how to basically, you know, punish tax havens, what to do against them if we wanted to sort of, you know, get rid of some of what these jurisdictions sort of do and are able to offer. I mean, you know, again, sort of, you know, contemporary economists and others do make suggestions for certain things that we can do. You know, they include things as a public registry for ownership of certain assets, so that you can not hide behind anonymous companies as easily as, you know, you would otherwise be able to do. They also suggest certain structural changes in the way taxes are allocated globally, which is especially relevant for corporate taxation, which would also take away certain opportunities that tax havens use. But my sense is that in addition to all these things, which you can do and which are important, I think it would require a sort of, a concerted effort in, different, powerful, high income, wealthy economies such as the United States and certain Western European countries to lean on what I call the avoidance industry, because without also targeting the enablers, I don't think you will sort of fully, achieve what you're looking to achieve with these other measures. And a first step, to do that would be to slap much higher fines on banks and law firms that are essentially caught in the act when, things become public. Recently, there has been sort of a little bit more of that in certain very punctual and individual cases, but across the board, when banks are fined for, misconduct in this area, the amounts that they're made to pay, they sound, large for us, but they are really sort of just the cost of doing business for most of these banks. So it's not something that actually sort of hurts significantly. And I would say that that is something that additionally would need to change. The question of their significance and sort of what is the qualitative, but also more importantly, in this question, the quantitative importance of these tax havens. This again is sort of the domain of contemporary economists who try to sort of put some numbers on it. And, the numbers offered vary a little bit, but I think there's a sort of consensus of sort that would say that roughly 10% of overall global household wealth is stashed away in tax havens. And that's a number that conceals very considerable regional differences. So the numbers are a little bit lower for the United States. They're roughly that as is estimated for many European countries, but they're much higher, for instance, for many sub-Saharan African countries or for places in the Gulf, for that matter, for Gulf countries, and for Russia. There's a correlation that's interesting here with natural resource wealth. So oil and other natural resources, and the kind of sort of political and social fabric that creates leads to very high amounts of wealth stashed away offshore. And we can also say, in addition to simply the amounts of wealth held in tax havens and evading and avoiding taxation, that on the sort of individual level, tax evasion and avoidance is very much concentrated amongst the highest earners. So it is something that indirectly, therefore, contributes to income inequality also on that level within individual countries. Okay.
Vanessa, I welcome your particular targeting of the enablers, because I think that is one of the key tasks ahead of us is to target the enablers and if necessary, increase the sanctions against them, because at the moment the sanctions, as you so rightly say, are so low as not to be a deterrent at all. I'm going to try and fit in another couple of questions. Next one's from Balaji Balagon. Excuse me if I haven't pronounced that correctly. Many thanks for this fascinating talk, Vanessa. In your research, did you find any tax haven activities relating to Central and Eastern Europe, especially during the region's collaborations with Latin America and African countries?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a fascinating question. And my sense is that you would find a story there, but it would play out more within Europe and it would be related to Switzerland. You would find a story there if you were to sort of look, more in depth in archives that's in East Central Europe and in Swiss archives sort of in a much more targeted way than I was able to do that. You do sort of get a little bit of a glimpse that with the consolidation of Soviet rule over East Central Europe between the end of the Second World War and say 1947, 1948, so within that very short window of time, there is a move of funds out of East Central Europe, especially to Switzerland, by people who are essentially fearing, what the Soviet Union will do once it sort of fully consolidates its control of that part of Europe, and that is something where where I would be willing to say there's not necessarily sort of a full-scale legitimate moral reason for a tax haven to exist, taking into account that kind of scenario that's unfolding there. But that's something where I think it's more understandable and sort of, we can, from the perspective of someone who's moving their funds to Switzerland at this point, we can sort of see more reasons for why to do that, that don't exclusively sort of have to do with a fear of higher taxes, but that also have to do with, a fear of political repression and again, authoritarian control and government in some of these places. So that's one of the exceptions. That's why I said almost no justification for the existence of tax haven. That I would sort of make a small exception there. But that is overall, I think, the East Central Europe story that is there that I haven't investigated as part of my book project because it deals primarily with Western Europe. I haven't come across anything in the developing world. There is a sort of East Central Europe question that plays out again in the late 70s and early 80s in the Eurodollar market, when countries like Poland and others tap the Eurodollar markets for loans at some point, but that's slightly different and that's not directly related to tax havens.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. A whole load of other questions have come through, and thank you to everyone, but I'm afraid we won't have time to cover them all. But we do have one more question from Suming Ku. Could Professor Ogle comment on any relationship between the rise of tax havens and the frustrated demands at the United Nations by the G77 group for a new international economic order and economic rights duties of states? Very good question, by the way.
Yeah, so that's a great question because it's actually sort of how I initially became interested in this topic. So I was writing an article on the new international economic order, which was a movement by third world countries to basically use the UN apparatus and also UNCTAD and its other sub-organizations to use these structures to basically rein in the powers and the behavior of multinational corporations in these newly independent countries. And what I found when I was writing this article, and this was never meant to be sort of more than just this article, was that one complaint that low-income countries had already in the 1960s and 70s was that multinationals were using transfer pricing and also artificial profit shifting to avoid paying taxes in the developing world. And this is how I basically got interested in tax havens. So while this problem was not at the very top of the sort of list of complaints that low-income countries had and that led them to form the new international economic order, it was certainly an issue that they had identified, and that was sort of part of a bigger set of problems they saw with multinational corporations and how they did business in the global south in particular. So there's definitely a relation in that sense.
Right, well, I think we'll leave it there. And before thanking Vanessa and all the other panelists and contributors today, I'd just like to make a couple of comments. First of all, this conference will resume for the second day tomorrow, and please note the slightly earlier time of 12:15. So that's 12:15 GMT for the second day. And tomorrow's session is going to be looking more at the post-colonial era. We'll be examining the legacies of imperialism and colonialism and discussing what part reparations and taxation might play in remedying the enormous harms that have been caused to the previously colonized countries and their peoples. We'll be starting the session at 12:30 tomorrow with a keynote address on colonial macroeconomics, then and now, from Dr. Ndogo Sambasila. So something to really I'm really looking forward to that. So that brings this session, today's session, to an end. But before we all click the leave button, can I ask you to very briefly unmute yourselves and thank Dr. Vanessa Ogle and all the other contributors to the session today in the time-honored fashion by putting your hands together and clapping. So